Hi there. Thanks for tuning in. This is the sermon video for August the 9th at Trinity Mennonite Church. The story for today is Jesus walking on the water. Do you have the faith to walk on water with him?
Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up onto a mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." They were so frightened they screamed. Just then Jesus spoke to them, "Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. As he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshipped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son."
Today's story is one of the wow stories of the New Testament, where we sometimes would like to put ourselves into the story just to see the power of Jesus' miracles. And we see other stories like this where the hero overcomes the water. And so we could read from this that Jesus has power over nature. We could read from this that Jesus has power over chaos, and then extrapolate from that Jesus has power over the chaos in our lives. Either way, this is a beautiful story of Jesus' power and his relationship with his disciples. But there are some interesting questions that I think are written into this story, especially as it relates to Jesus' reactions to his disciples and his relationship with the crowds, which is our theme for this summer. So Jesus is, in this story, he's overcoming the water. He's walking miraculously on the water. But this is especially interesting in relation to the story that comes before it. So, in the earlier story, Jesus is feeding the crowd. And it comes after the story of John the Baptist. So in this Matthew chapter 14, we have these three stories connected together. So Jesus hears about his friend, about his relative, John the Baptist. This is a man that he loves, that he's grown up with, and at the same time, they've been working together in bringing about God's kingdom. So Jesus is experiencing grief because he's a human being, and he wants to get away to have quiet time within which to do his grieving. But he can't because the crowd is around them. And the crowd, they're not just bothering Jesus, they're bothering the disciples. So in the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, it begins by saying Jesus wanted to get away, but he couldn't because of the crowds. And then the disciples said, "Jesus, send the crowds away." But Jesus refused to do that. Instead, he healed them, which is already a miracle. He taught them, demonstrating authority, as we've seen in many other stories, which is already itself a kind of a miracle too. And then feeding them miraculously. There's so much that Jesus does for the crowd, and they haven't done anything to earn it or deserve it. In fact, they've sort of done the opposite. They're crowding around, they're inconveniencing Jesus and his disciples, and yet he's still showing his power to them. He's still teaching them and healing them and feeding them. So then in today's story, we see that this situation is continuing. So Jesus is going to dismiss the crowds, just like his disciples had asked him to do, but he does it after he's fed them and healed them and taught them. He dismissed the crowds, but first he sends his disciples ahead. So he sends the disciples ahead, and they're probably going to go off and do extra work. They might be getting some food ready. They might be getting a place to sleep ready. They might have connections in the nearby villages. Whatever it is, they're going off to work, and then Jesus dismisses the crowds. Well, and I think there's an interesting parallel in these stories with the relationship that Jesus has with the crowds versus what he has with his disciples. So, what did the crowd do to deserve what they got? Well, I mentioned that before. Probably nothing. They just showed up. And they showed up in sort of an inconvenient way. And sometimes Jesus questions the motivations of the crowd, that they've just come to see a miracle. And so in those situations, he doesn't give them a miracle, but here he does. Now, how did they react to it? What did they think of it? Well, we don't really know, but the crowd responds positively. They showed up, Jesus did cool things, and they were impressed. That's really all that we get from this. And it might have built Jesus' reputation, but we don't really know beyond that. So Jesus dismisses the crowd. He's done good things for them, he's impressed them, and then he dismisses them. But he also dismisses his disciples. He sends them ahead so that he can get some time by himself. So he goes up to the mountain to pray. He's still mourning, he's still grieving, and now he's needing to rest on top of all of that. And then, early in the morning, so presumably Jesus has been praying through the night, the disciples are in the boat, but there's a storm that's come up. They haven't been able to reach their destination. And so Jesus is approaching them on the water. It would be great if somehow the gospel writer had decided to explain to us what Jesus' motivation was. Was he walking on the water to impress them? Did he think that they were asleep and wouldn't notice? We don't know exactly, but Jesus is walking on the water out to meet them, and they start panicking because they, like us, have never seen somebody walking on the water, and it's in the middle of the night or very, very early in the morning, and probably not a lot of light, and so they probably couldn't quite see straight enough to know what exactly it was that they were looking at. So they see somebody walking on the water, and they are terrified. Jesus senses their terror and responds, tells them to calm down. It's only him. So we have this already a different reaction. What kind of miracle did Jesus do for the crowd? Well, they got to see Jesus do a miracle of healing for the crowd's benefit, and the crowd was impressed. They got to see a miracle of Jesus making food, which was for the crowd's benefit, and the crowd was impressed, if they even knew that a miracle had happened. And Jesus did a miracle of teaching, demonstrating spiritual authority, and what did the crowd do? They were impressed. Now, the disciples, they get to see a miracle too. What's their reaction? They're terrified. It's not because the disciples are corrupted or because their motivations are wrong. They're terrified because this is a different kind of miracle. This is a bigger, a stronger miracle, and they don't know what to do with it. So Jesus does a miracle for the crowds, and they're impressed. Jesus does a miracle for the disciples, and they're freaking out. Then Jesus gets into the boat, he approaches the boat. Peter calls out to him. Peter is evaluating the situation. Presumably, we can kind of put ourselves into Peter's head here a little bit. Peter sees something he doesn't recognize, but he hears something that he does, right? So he has to bridge these two worlds. He wants to know if this thing that he sees, this apparition walking on the water, is the same as the Jesus that he's been learning from for years. He wants to bridge these two. And so the way that he does that, he says, hey, the Jesus that I know will use this as a teaching experience. The Jesus that I know will share his power. And so as a test, if this is you, Jesus, then share your power with me and I'll walk with you. Right? So then Peter's willing to step into the miracle then too. So what does it mean for the crowd to participate in the miracle? Well, somebody gets to walk again. What does it mean for the crowd to participate in the miracle of feeding? They get to eat. What does it mean for Peter to participate in the miracle? He has to step out of a boat. This is a totally different encounter with Jesus and an entirely different encounter with the miracle. So Jesus participates with this test. He doesn't hesitate. He says, yeah, come on out. Come, he says. Peter steps out and he's walking. Now, what exactly is it? I asked the question at the beginning, if you had enough power, enough faith to walk on the water. If Jesus extended the call to you to come out of the boat, would you have the power? Well, we don't know exactly how much of this is Peter's faith and how much of this is the power that Jesus is giving him. But still, Peter is taking a bigger leap of faith than anyone in the crowd had done. Sometimes we like to think that Jesus treats everybody the same. And of course, in Jesus' eyes, we were all created by God. Jesus loves all of us. Jesus loves his disciples just as much as he loves the people in the crowd. But there's a different reaction based on the group that we were in, that people are in. And in the stories in the Gospels, we see these groupings. In the letters of the New Testament, we see the way that those writers had kind of subdivided the world. So Jesus sometimes talks about the powers and how the disciples will need to speak to power. Paul does that later on, talking about the powers, the relationship between the church and the power, or the principalities and powers. It kind of bridges the gap between political power, spiritual power, somewhere in between there. He's lumped them together. Also, there's a grouping that probably more often in the New Testament letters, but it talks about the crowd, the church, and the Jews. Those three categories. So there's a different relationship between the Jews and the church and the crowd. And sometimes it means those particular Jews, but mostly it's sort of a symbolic reference to the legalistic, heavy, burdening religious structures that they came from. And the New Testament church needs to go beyond legalism to a grace-filled encounter with God. And so then we have these four groups: the powers, the Jews, the religious structures that people have come from, the crowd, and the church. So within those four groups, we will find ourselves in one of them, and when we have encounters with other people, there's probably going to be some sort of way of putting that person into one of those other groups. Jesus responds differently to different people. And it would be great if we could sort of pick and choose the way that Jesus would respond to us, but it doesn't work that way. Jesus is interacting with the crowd in a fantastic way. The crowds have come to hear Jesus. Jesus feeds them. Jesus heals them. Jesus teaches them. Jesus loves the crowds. And then we see Jesus' reaction with his own disciples, and he scares them, and he chastises them. Jesus' words for Peter are much harsher than any words he has for the crowds. In fact, when the disciples want the crowd to be dismissed, the crowd who's showed up in a way that inconveniences Jesus and the disciples, presumably unprepared for the situation. The disciples want to have their quality time, and they want the crowd to deal with their own food needs. But Jesus doesn't speak harshly to the crowd and say, hey, why didn't you bring any food? Why are you following me around? You've got what you needed. No, Jesus has harsh words for the disciples. And then in the boat, Jesus has harsh words for his disciples. Jesus expects more from his closest followers, which is in many ways a switch from the way that we expect the world to interact with us. So we have to put ourselves into this story. This is how we interact with Jesus. We put ourselves into the stories of his encounters. And so then the question is, well, where do you fit in this story? You can be in the crowd. There's nothing wrong with that. The crowd has showed up. They're interested. They want to experience Jesus. They want to see what Jesus has to offer. And if there's another teacher the next week, they might go to that teacher as well. But they're interested and they're willing to learn, and Jesus loves the crowd. The crowd isn't a bad place to be. And then with the disciples, they were part of the crowd before. They heard Jesus teach. They may have seen a miracle from Jesus, and then they decided to follow him. Well, Jesus took those followers and then put them through a bit of a process of learning and challenging their situations. He's discipling them, which is a kind of a fun Christian word that we've made up, but he's disciplining them. He's teaching them. He's correcting them. That's what it means to be a disciple. So sometimes what happens is we want the benefits of being in the crowd. We want the teaching. We want the miracles. But we don't want the consequences of being in the church. Right? The higher expectations, the role of feeding the crowds. So sometimes what happens is we want to remove ourselves from those responsibilities. So where do you fit in this story? Well, probably you're watching this because you're part of a church, probably because you're part of this church. And then you understand that you are part of the disciples, that you're on the boat. That's fine. The boat is a great place to be, but already in this story we see that the boat is a dangerous place to be. And Jesus doesn't make things safe on the boat for all time. Jesus sent the disciples into that boat. Jesus sends us into situations of chaos and situations where we won't be able to control things, and situations where we won't understand. But he sends us there for our enrichment and for the betterment of the world. Sometimes we understand that there are going to be consequences, but we want to get ourselves on the best boat possible. And when we're in that process, we're not on any boat. We're just still in the crowd. It's uncomfortable to think sometimes that Jesus has harsher words for his disciples than he has for the crowds. And in the story, it's easy to differentiate between the disciples and the crowd. It's easy to differentiate between the church, the symbolic church, and the world, right? There are 13 people on the boat, and there's the world. Now, what's the difference between them? Well, now we would say the contemporary group of disciples is the church. We inherit their relationship with Jesus. We inherit their responsibilities. And so that's us. And if you've gathered to hear this sermon, if you've gathered in a digital space to pay attention to these stories, then yeah, you're a part of that church. In the church, we've had to make an adjustment on what counts as a regular attender. A generation or so ago, you would have had to be there 3 out of 4 Sundays to be considered a regular attender, and if you weren't, then somebody might have given you a phone call. Well, now, 1 Sunday out of 4 makes you a regular attender in a lot of spaces, and it isn't like there's a hierarchy of more attendance that makes you better or more important. What happens in the boat and what happens in our lives now is orientation. Are you oriented towards Jesus? Is your faithfulness there? But then the flip side of that, the following Jesus requirement of that too, is in this story, Jesus' orientation is still towards the crowds. Yeah, Jesus gets away, like we need to sometimes, to rest, to recharge, to reconnect with God. Jesus gets away to be with his closest people, to teach them and to fellowship with them, but his orientation is towards the crowds. This is what it means to be the church. The boat wasn't perfect. There were 12 disciples on the boat, all of whom would fall away from Jesus at the crucifixion. One of them would betray Jesus. All of them would fail him in some way. And many of them would become heroes of the faith later on, but they would go through a time of trial and testing. Jesus has harsh words and high expectations for his followers. That's what it means to be a part of the church. That's what it means to be committed. It doesn't mean being perfect. There were screw-ups on that boat. There are people with bad records within the church. But the question is orientation. Are you oriented towards Jesus? Are you pursuing Jesus, pursuing an encounter with Jesus? And if you are, then you are pointed in the right direction. But we have to be also then pointed towards the crowd. We don't follow Jesus for our own benefit. If the disciples were following Jesus for their own benefit, they made the wrong choice. We follow Jesus because in him we find love. In him we find a world that makes sense. And that world makes sense when the least and the greatest all receive blessing. So let's orient ourselves towards Jesus. Let's work together as a church, perfect and imperfect as we may be, to benefit the world, accepting the correction, accepting the guidance of God so that we can fulfill his purposes. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being a part of this congregation.